Sorry, the system is slow. There we go. We
There
are
it
recording.
is. Thanks, Karen. All right. Good morning, everybody. This is the Rulemaking Advisory Committee meeting for Senate Bill 763, related to the licensure of pharmaceutical sales representatives. And I see I have a typo in my agenda already that I said RAC meeting number 1. Again, this is RAC meeting number 2. Sorry about that. My name is Numi Griffith. I'm a senior policy advisor with the Division of Financial Regulation at Oregon's Department of Consumer and Business Services. I see that I have at least represented all the organizations that I'm expecting as formal RAC members. Rather than doing a roll call today, I'm just going to read down the list, basically confirm that we have here, since I've seen you in the room. We have Anne Murray representing Bristol Myers Squibb. We have Daria McGrew representing Pharma. We have Brian Van Hoy representing GMM Health. We have Chloe Becker representing the Oregon Coalition for Affordable Prescriptions. Actually, I did not see Jen. Do we have Jen Baker from Providence on? No. Okay. Well, that.
No.
We have enough folks to get started, I believe. So it's thanks.
Jen, yeah, Jen is unable to attend this morning.
Okay, thank you. Let's see. Have Maribeth Garino from Osberg, Rick Blackwell from Pacific Source, and I believe I saw Mark Bonaro from OMA as well. So just a couple of general housekeeping things. It's general Zoom etiquette things. Please, if you're not speaking, keep your audio muted to avoid background noise and feedback. I invite formal RAC members to use video throughout the meeting discussion if that's preference. It is also okay to turn your video off if you prefer not to be seen. But I would ask all other meeting participants to keep their video off. Normally, I would ask people to use the raise your hand function in Teams, but since I'll be sharing my screen for a lot of the presentation and I actually cannot see that, just feel free to jump in while I'm using screen share. And if you have questions, comments, etc., and we will address them as they come up. We do have some time reserved for public comment towards the end of the meeting. If you would like to provide public comment and are not formally a member of the RAC, please send a message in the chat to Karen Winkle, coordinator, and we will add you to the list for public comment. When we get to that period of the time, we'll call on individuals to unmute and turn on the video and deliver their comments. The meeting's being recorded, and we will post the recording and the RAC meeting materials to the DFR website. So a couple of general notes up at the top is kind of just talking about our current approach to the rules. Since I discussed last time, we're kind of doing a two-phase approach given the short timeline to get this off the ground, that we're planning to do a temporary rule that will take effect January 1st for the sort of first year implementation. And then we're going to have more extensive staff permanent rules that will be the sort of long-term implementation of the program. Let's see. So for today's discussion, I've provided 2 copies of my draft, one of which is an interlineated copy of the draft rules that I presented last time. Because I removed a lot of material from that. It's not the easiest thing in the world to read. So, and the reason for that is that I wanted to focus today's discussion on the stuff that we're going to put into the temporary rule, which I'm really viewing as just the bare essentials of what we need to get this off the ground. And so there's a couple things that I'm not going to address in today's meeting. One of which is the sort of longer term, more detailed continuing education section, which I have removed from the current draft. And the other one of which is the sort of periodic or upon request reporting materials, which since we won't be collecting reports for quite a while, probably so based on the feedback from last meeting, what we're probably going to be looking at doing is switching to an annual requirement with that kind of based on a year-by-year period. So basically for the first year of reporting required for contacts with healthcare providers would run basically from January 1, 2022 to December 31st, 2022. And then we would have the comments, the reports due at in probably April or May of 2023, with that having those reports filed being a condition of renewal of licensure for 2024. So since we're not going to be collecting any of the sort of contact reporting until into 2023, we don't need those rules. So I've removed that from the current draft and I'm not going to be addressing that today. I'm hoping to get pretty much everything ironed out for the temp rule today. And the reason for that partially is because I want to bring back the much more extensive text related to continuing education and reporting next month's meeting. So that's in 3 weeks from now. Go over the materials that are related to that there. And so we can kind of move the discussion forward for the permanent rule, the stuff that we're going to politically do that. Couple other things I'll mention before I jump into the draft. I received a few comments, mostly from drug manufacturers related to other disclosure requirements beyond what we were discussing in here as applied to pharmaceutical sales representatives. Based on the references which we're talking about, the approach that states like Nevada have taken to disclosure related to pharmaceuticals, I believe that those comments were directed to the drug price transparency program and related provisions for that. We really view that as kind of being outside of the scope of discussion for this rulemaking. I'm not looking to reopen any of the administrative rules related to drug price transparency as part of this rulemaking. And beyond that, most of the changes that folks were asking for in relation to that, we're asking to change terms that are defined by the underlying statute, not by administrative rule. And so it wouldn't be in our authority to change those anyway. So if there are folks who are interested in trying to push changes to our approach to drug price transparency, I would encourage you to take that up in the legislative session. I will not be addressing those particular matters.
Before you go further, Anne Marie, my comment on Nevada was simply on the template that they're using to collect the information. And so if you take a look at the Nevada template, you'll see that it provides a format in which the reporting can take place. It wasn't specifically about anything required by Nevada that may be required in Oregon's drug transparency bill. It was simply about how to report the information that you're looking for.
Okay, I appreciate that clarification. I did receive several comments related to Nevada, and so that is helpful to know that. Certainly that's something that we can look at and all discuss with our licensing team about as we're working on implementation. I believe we do have Haven Garber, who's the licensing team manager, on the call once again to potentially address some technical matters that are outside of my area of expertise. And as far as we get to some things, if there are some of the things that are in our rules, the draft rules are related to the technical limitations of the platform that we're going to be using to implement this, and therefore we have limited ability to change the way things are written. So that's things like there was discussion of the possibility of prorating fees last time. That's really something that is limited by our technical platform and the way that we're already implementing things. And so based on the way that we're approaching this, it won't really be possible to address that. Okay, and as I mentioned before, I'm planning to use next meeting to talk about the stuff that I pulled out of the draft for today. So we're working on temp rule today, stuff for January 1st, and then come back next month and hopefully be able to talk about stuff that is going to go into the permanent rule. So that is the reporting requirements, and secondly, the long-term implementation of our continuing education certification of providers, demonstrating proof of having completed credit hours, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, and with that, are there any questions or comments on that sort of general overview, philosophical approach, et cetera? Okay. Hearing nothing further, I'm just going to kind of run down the plan for today. There is a couple of things that I did not get to last time, so I'm going to start off with a discussion of the draft rule sections on prohibited activities and civil penalties. Next, I'm going to kind of go over an overview of the revisions that are in the current draft, which is what I'm planning to use as the basis for the temp rule, and will be effective January 1st. And then the last thing, kind of in the formal agenda that I've put forward, is there was a couple of changes discussed that were suggested in comments. I have asked Karen to send out everybody's comments to the group as well, so people have those materials available. And we'll have the opportunity to review those at your leisure and kind of get a sense of everything that's going on in the discussion. I know when I've been on the other side of the table, that's something I've always appreciated, is seeing the feedback of other RAC stakeholders and kind of getting a better sense of where everybody's at. So there was 2 comments, one of which was from Pharma, the other one of which was from Pacific Source, that were proposing kind of potential changes to the definition of pharmaceutical representative. And so I'm going to ask Daria and Rick to explain their thinking behind some of those ideas. And then as I didn't feel like I had enough information at this time to really decide whether that feedback was something we wanted to integrate into the rule. So we will bring that up towards the end of the meeting.
Okay, happy to talk about it. Tell me when the right time is.
Sounds good. Okay. And I'm going to use my clean copy so that I'm not looking at all of the interlineation. So, come on. All right. Can we see that? Okay, should be my Word document with draft rules.
Looks good.
Great, thanks. So I wanted to start off the discussion with these sort of 2 rules that I did not have time to get to at our meeting at the beginning of this month. So this is what I've captioned as basically Rule 13, Rule 14, which are, and the other thing I'll note is, like, I've left the rule captions the same, even though I've deleted most of the content from my previous draft, simply to kind of have consistency in discussion. So if folks are referring to various rule numbers, I know what you're talking about. So these are the 2 that I didn't get to last time. The first is kind of this, and this is just related to the sort of potential penalties, as well as the sort of things that would potentially be punishable, referable to our enforcement division. A lot of this is recreating stuff that is in the statute directly. So if we go over that, there is this material comes straight from the statute. It's prohibition on deceptive or misleading marketing. This is straight from the statute, which is related to use of titles or designations that could be viewed as misleading for a healthcare provider. Also from the statute, attending an examination of a patient without their consent. And this last provision, I believe, came from some of our other regulatory programs, which is just a general prohibition on knowingly submitting false information to the department. Any comments or questions on rule caption number 13 related to prohibited conduct for licensees?
I've got a question.
Yeah.
Don't these rules already exist as part of the PDMA Act of 1987?
I would have to take a look at that to see how much duplication there is. In part, the thought with this is to, since we do have authority for civil penalties and licensure, revocation, or suspension, I think the intent here, rather than trying to duplicate something that exists in federal law, would be to kind of point out, here are the things that we are looking to be able to apply penalties, whether that is related to continuing validity of licensure or civil penalties, that these are the things that would point basically to Rule 14 down here. So I appreciate that some of this may be duplicative of restrictions on conduct. We're not trying to duplicate that. We're just trying to kind of point to what. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Hey, Numi, I can weigh in real quick. I'm sorry I was muted. This wouldn't be the Prescription Drug Marketing Act. You know, that's all about health and safety around drug sample dispersion. This would be duplicative in the fact that, you know, from an FDA Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, you cannot promote, you have to be truthful, non-misleading, et cetera. So there are duplicates from the federal statutes on all of these. However, it's not the PDMA.
Okay, appreciate that.
But it is duplicative, just of something else.
Correct. It is duplicative. It's just not because you're right. You know, drug companies now can't do number one, you know, federally in promotion for Drug and Cosmetic Act. So that is duplicative. But if it's in their statute as well, it's not that it's any different.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, I appreciate that information. I mean, and to some extent, I mean, ultimately, this information is already duplicated in our statute as well. I know, like I've said, one of the things that we're trying to avoid is using rules to recreate information that already exists in our statute.
Yeah,
however, at the same
I'm sorry, Numi, go ahead.
At the same time, like one of the other things is in terms of what we're expecting people to do, whether it is just a sort of drafting philosophy thing from my end, is I think we should try and let our licensees or the compliance departments of their employers be able to have all this information just looking at the rules without having to dive into the statute as well. So like, I recognize that it is duplicative both of what we have from Senate Bill 763, wherever that ends up landing in the Oregon Code ultimately, as well as from federal law. There are some things that are duplicated in both state law, federal law. I mean, ultimately, my goal with this is to let somebody who's in compliance, let somebody who is applying as a licensee, if they're basically an independent contractor or something like that, to be able to know what the expectations of them are just by looking at the rules. So I recognize it's duplicative, but
and from the duplicative side, I think the biggest part we would that's different is the fact that any of the transfer of value, you know, that's all under the Affordable Care Act. So right now, Oregon residents can look up their physicians on the CMS site. They can get all that information. That's the part that I'm a little surprised isn't preempted, but that's it's in your law, so it's already there.
Yes. And I appreciate that, Brian. So that is kind of the general thing. Like if there's not any, like I think we've kind of exhausted the discussion around the duplicative language side of things. So are there any other comments about what we have in here? I mean, ultimately, the thing that is not duplicative is number 4 down here. So like that is kind of the main thing. And like, I don't think that this is tremendously onerous in terms of like, just don't make false statements to us. It's pretty basic. So any other comments related to prohibited conduct? Okay. Hearing none, I'm going to move down to rule caption 14 here. Yeah, that is the entire thing. So there's one change that I've made to the draft from last, which you would have had a chance to review, is that I've added the express mention of license revocation or suspension in this rule. That was previously, I was just mentioning imposition of civil penalties. I did get some comments from proponents of the bill suggesting that we kind of mention that those things are in there to some extent. And one of the things is that in earlier drafts, I had kind of a much more detailed consideration of what level of civil penalties we would apply for various types of prohibited conduct. And ultimately, we backed away from that, mostly because the statute itself doesn't give us a whole lot of wiggle room in penalty application. That basically we are given a range of $1,000 to $3,000 per violation, and that is counted per day of violation. That it specifies that each day that a violation continues is considered a separate violation. So it doesn't give us a ton of flexibility, and kind of what we are hoping to be able to do is to give our enforcement team the flexibility to be able to negotiate settlements with licensees who have run afoul of the prohibited conduct terms in one way or another, and kind of making sure that they are given the flexibility to kind of determine whether suspension and a fine is the most appropriate, justifying doing a revocation if it's a really severe violation, kind of giving the enforcement team the flexibility they need to craft an appropriate penalty for the particular circumstances. So what I have done with this is basically said, here's the things that we're going to consider applying civil penalties or revocation or suspension of license for, is engaging in prohibited conduct, which is referred up to 13. That's the main reason, as I said, why we have that language that is also in the statute, is making clear that these are things that we would be able to apply penalties for, is engaging in that prohibited conduct. The second thing is failure to timely report information. Obviously, this is not in the current draft or the temp rule, so I'm going to probably pull that out of the temp rule draft, but it can be something that I believe would be appropriate to basically say we're requiring these reports. We're going to require them annually, is currently the plan. And beyond that, it's simply put that if you're not filing the information, that is a violation of the rules and the statute, and therefore could be subject to civil penalties. And then the last thing, which does not derive from the statute, is basically a unlicensed practice clause, and that is based on specifically the terms of licensure from statute. Is you're required to have the license if you engage in business as a pharmaceutical representative in Oregon for 15 or more days. And so it basically says if you do that without getting a license, then you are subject to the same civil penalties. And obviously, since if somebody's doing that without a license, they're not subject to suspension and revocation. The only available penalty there is civil penalties. Any comments or questions on Rule 14, civil penalties, license revocation, or suspension?
Hey, Numi, this is Rick Blackwell from Pacific Source. I just wanted to ask a question. So to clarify, it looks like at some point there may be some penalties associated with reporting, with the quarterly reporting, or whatever, the licensee reporting, I should say. It's not quarterly. I'm not sure what the duration is at this point, but that won't be in the initial temp rules, right?
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, that is my intent. It's kind of just in rapidly redrafting these rules over the last week since I got. I appreciate all the comments and the thought and the feedback that was put into them. Since I recognize we're standing up a program that doesn't exist in the other states, so it's there are things that I have missed and kind of trying to bring the draft over. So the intent is for that second clause, the reporting of information, not to be in the temp rule, but that will be in the permanent rule. And so hopefully, based on the feedback from today, I'll be able to present 2 drafts in 3 weeks at our next meeting, one of which is going to be kind of the content that we're looking at for the temp rule, and then the second draft is going to be the stuff that is going to go into the permanent rule.
And this is Haven. I just wanted to mention that even regardless of how often we make the report, according to the statute, that information can be requested at any time. So I think that that subsection was also applied to a request by the director of that information outside of the normal reporting period, if I'm reading that correctly.
Yeah, that would be right. So actually, in consideration of that, rather than deleting this term, I think what I will do and look at having in the next draft is just have this referring to statute. So basically, I will put a clause in the temp rule that is saying failure to timely report any of the information described in Oregon laws, chapter 593, subsection, whatever it is, where it refers both to the authority for us to require periodic reporting as well as reporting at the request of the director. So thanks for pointing that out, Haven. There is still theoretically the possibility we could request the sort of contact information. And, you know, I think that it's relatively unlikely that we'll do that soon, but as we're kind of testing our tech platforms, you know, that may be something we would like to do. So keeping that possibility open is going to be important. And I'm not sure what the timeline is going to be for having an effective date on the temp rules as well. Any other questions or comments on civil penalties, license, suspension, or revocation? Okay. Hearing none. I'm going to, yes. Okay, it was just background noise. If you are not speaking, please remember to mute your line. Thank you. All right.
The job of the Department of Justice working with state and local law enforcement is to prevent.
Karen, can you see, is that Haven's line that is unmuted, maybe? Okay. All right. So I am going to move on to the material that has been changed in the current draft that is here. As I mentioned at the top, I've removed most of the CLE language as well as the reporting language, since the goal today is to mostly look at the stuff that is ultimately going to go into the temp rule, and the most detailed stuff is kind of related to the substituted continuing education language, which is less detailed. So go back up to the top. And let's see here. So things I'm going to mention. In both license application and renewal, I have added, well, the easier thing that I can mention is that I've changed residence telephone number to personal telephone number in both, based on feedback from last meeting. Since as we've recognized, a lot of people don't have residential telephone numbers anymore. So that's a pretty basic change, but as kind of, again, maintaining contact with people is important for our licensing department. So that's why we have that in there. The more interesting change maybe that we have added to both sections, we're asking for a social security number on the form. And that was something that I should have had in the initial rule that I did not have in. And down here, I've added two subsections, which is taken from our rules for insurance producer licensing with minor changes, which is kind of just discussing why we're doing this and what we can use it for. So we can collect social security numbers. There may be governmental uses in which this is required for compliance with federal or state law. And we can also use this as social security number as authorized for identification number for records, grades, examination scores, licensing purposes, or use by other government agencies. Subsection 6 here basically specifies that you can refuse to allow us to use the social security number for these purposes, but the use for compliance with state and federal law is not waivable, basically. So we are requiring collection. You can have it protected for usage, basically for these internal purposes that are listed in those three subsections of subsection 5 here. But we are collecting it because of some of our own reporting obligations related to licensees that we have to do to other state agencies. So we do need that information. I wanted to bring that.
So Numi, on all this information, I'm assuming, so license your information, address, et cetera, social security number, that's all confidential, that's not public, correct? Or is it going to be, will there be a site where you can look up everyone that has an Oregon license and find this information?
Haven, can you help out with an answer to that?
Sure. So there is a site that they can look up if we use the system we're looking at, but it won't have the information like social security number and home addresses. It will have a business address, a business contact information, the person's full name. It's a way for people in the public to be able to verify licensing, and it's something that's set up in NIPR currently.
Can I follow-up question to that? Could you speak to a generally just it would be my assumption that many different licensed professions have similar requirements? Is this sort of a standard for licensed professions? Is that?
Yes, absolutely. So so this is basically a requirement for almost all of our license types, unless it's a business entity, and then we deal with EINs. But we need a way that we have unique identifying characters to link up information from different areas. So when we start having CE providers provide us information and they're doing pre-licensing education, so they don't have a license yet. This is one way that you can link up that information. Additionally, we are obligated as the Division of Financial Regulation to provide information to the Department of Justice in relation to licensure in case there is a failure to pay child support or a failure to comply with other state laws. And they require the Social Security number to be able to link that information as well. So it's very standard that we would be using this information.
Great, thank you. Follow-up question to that. I think, as we mentioned in our letter, just general concerns about keeping personal information private. The specific concern for some of the representatives would be, you know, for example, they may have samples of controlled substances in their possession. So, you know, concerns that home addresses be kept confidential. Appreciate that the website that you were planning to use or might be using, you said that personal information wouldn't be on it. Is there a cross-reference to some existing Oregon code that could be included to make people more comfortable and feel assured that that information will be kept confidential?
I don't know what the statute is if one does apply. I do know that, you know, confidentiality amongst my team is part of their job. But I understand the concern, and I can definitely, Numi and I can take a look into that to see if there's something we can cross-reference. And so I'll leave it at that. Yes, we'll look into that.
Yeah, absolutely. I will take that back and see if we can get an answer for you on that before our next meeting.
And to kind of piggytail onto that, not only just the address of the representative that may have dangerous drugs in their possession, but it's also the doctors. Not all, you know, everybody knows pharmacies have these, but not all offices have them. So you're kind of providing the public, you know, here's where dangerous drugs are and the quantities.
There would never, since we're not requiring the providers, the health providers, to be licensed, that information wouldn't be part of the database. So that's part of the annual report, but that wouldn't be something that someone could go onto a website and just randomly look up. So we would have no reason to keep that information, or it would be available through the website.
Okay.
For that.
This is
Other
Tina Boone.
questions
Currently,
or
for the producer licensing system that we use, it only provides, when anybody from the outside is looking, it only provides the city and state and phone number. So it doesn't have any personal location or social security number.
Was that Val on the phone?
No, that was Tina Boone. She
Oh.
is my CE coordinator and is very familiar with the process that we'll be using for this. So she might step in to correct me occasionally.
Oh, thank you, Tina. Sorry for, it's a general reminder if you're on the phone, and particularly if you're on the phone, please introduce yourself when you're speaking.
Haven, this is Rick Blackwell from Pacific Source. Just feels like it'd be a good time to mention that Oregon also enforces the ID Theft Act. And so there's probably some standards about keeping records, you know, personal information out of the hands of folks that don't need it. In addition, you've got public records requirements that keep those safe from disclosure that might be useful for this group's knowledge.
Yeah, and I would think, you know, just based on the previous comments too, that you'd want to make sure that that personal information is protected, and that, for example, I think I just heard phone number. So if I know the name of a representative and their phone number and the city they live in, I would think that's too much. But, you know, that's really someone for legal to look at from that ID Theft Act, et cetera.
And I believe those are business contact information, not personal. So
Okay.
Business phone number, business city and state, not personal.
Thank you.
So we could eliminate the personal telephone number verbiage?
We are,
That, oh, I'm sorry.
go ahead, Haven.
That would be required as the regulatory agency. So we have a way to contact the person individually because this license is required by the individual, not by the company. So we would want to be able to directly contact that person regardless of their relationship with their employer. So if something happens that we cannot reach them at a business location, we would need to be able to reach their personal information.
Right, so this is not about information that's going to be posted in terms of the personal phone number. It's about records for our reference in terms of being able to keep in contact with our licensees regarding compliance and other potential issues that might come up. Any other questions or concerns in relation to this language?
Numi, Anne Marie again. I think we would reserve the opportunity to comment further since we just saw this for the first time last night on the potential implications of requiring social security numbers. I think it was Haven who suggested initially that it would be a great way, or probably the most uniquely identifying way, to be able to match up information that is submitted to the department with the correct licensee. And there was some reference to continuing education, pre-licensure of education as one of the reasons that they're requiring social security number. And I'm confused as to how that would come into play unless, of course, the CE provider was asking for a social security number, which in my years of doing CE for my law license, I've never once provided. So I'm just trying to figure out exactly what, I understand the DOJ and child support link, but I didn't understand the reference to any other uses that the department might have for this information.
Haven, do you have anything to add on that? I think this is that the only thing that I was pointed to was the child support issue, but the language that I pulled from the producer licensing referred to other federal uses or state uses. Haven, do you know of anything else off the top of your head?
No, that was just as an example of the reason we need a unique identifying qualifier. And we can look into, I don't know how it's currently linked with NIPR, the system with CE, and I don't know if Tina has that answer. But I was just listing that as a possibility and why sometimes we need that unique identifier. But regardless of the CE comment, it is required, as I stated, for DOJ and for those tracking purposes. And as was pointed out, that this is pretty common in the licensure world.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with my professional license. That's why I raised it. So perhaps we could consider Numi some language that specifically relates to the why we're asking for this information and not just a general submission requirement allowing the department to do with it what it reasonably determines it should use it for. I think we can narrow this language down a lot more concisely, tightly, and securely.
I appreciate that. I understand it's sensitive information that people would have some discomfort about giving out. So I will take that back and look at potential revisions to the language.
Yeah, so from a pharmacy license perspective, at least I know it varies by state, but I've never had to use social security number for renewal or registration.
This is Tina Boone. So currently the system we use, the pre-license education, when they take the exam, they link their social with our system through state-based systems in order to automatically upload those results into our system. And then the social for us we only internally use that. So I don't, and I think it's just to link the background check and the continuing education. That's for the producers. So I'm not, I mean, this is different with the pharmaceutical, but that's the only reason we use it right now.
And who's that for, Tina? What licensees?
Our producer licensing. So our system, we're kind of using that same system. So that's how we use it currently. So.
Can you give me an example? What's a producer licensing? I'm sorry, I'm not following you.
Sorry, for our our insurance agents, we use our state-based systems, this system that we're wanting to use for this. So.
Okay, thanks, Tina, and thanks for the discussion around this. Since I've put more new language into the continuing education stuff, I want to move on to that, and if we have some time at the end, we can. If there's still any additional concerns or questions related to the changes that I've made up here, we can come back to that. So I am going to move down to Rule 4, education, continuing education requirements, kind of given this sensitive timeline and the degree of complexity that is within our continuing education rules for other programs. Elected to remove most of that language for the purposes of licensure in 2022, which is, of course, our effective date, and have thrown together this draft rule for our discussion, which is to say I don't think it's perfect. I would be very surprised if it's good to go, but just kind of getting out a general idea of how we want to approach this for the first year, given that we're not going to be able to kind of set up our registration of continuing education providers within the next few months. So just kind of going over, this is adapted slightly from the rule that I presented, draft rule that I presented earlier this month. And I'm going to run through this and then ask if there's any questions after I've finished that. So what we're looking at for education requirements for licensure in 2022. So this is the material that's going to go into the temp rule. We're going to ask for applicants to certify that they plan to complete at least 15 hours of education prior to applying for licensure renewal. So that would be for applying for a renewal for effective license in 2023. So basically what I'm saying is that you don't need to have anything done when you apply for the initial license for 2022 only. So no education required before licensure for the first year, and that's just because of all of the steps that we need to take to get this program stood up. For what we're going to accept as qualified education, subsection 2 here, we're going to accept as qualified education any credit hours which are earned in education programs which are approved for pharmaceutical sales representatives, which I just recognize that is not how I've used the term throughout the rules, so pull that out. Pharmaceutical representatives seeking licensure or license renewal by another United States jurisdiction, except as otherwise provided. So we're going to do basically full reciprocity for any licensure, any CE that has been set up by Chicago and approved for Chicago or DC or any other jurisdiction, which I think those are the only two, but I could be wrong. So that is that. The other provisions, since we are using SBS, state-based system provided through the National Insurance Producer Registry to track all of the information related to this license, we're going to ask any entities that are going to be acting as CE providers for this purpose to be registered with NIPR. And that is simply so that they can have basically the certification that CE has been completed sent to us directly through our system instead of trying to have our staff vet certificates from whoever sent to us directly by the licensee. So that is what we are going to ask for. And there were several comments both from consumer advocates and insurers asking for reiteration on the express prohibition on CE provided by licensee's employer. That is in the statute. I can't change it. So just additional clarification, we will not accept credits for continuing education programs that were provided by a licensee's employer. One note that I'll have on this language is the statute does not prohibit a licensee from getting continuing education from a drug manufacturer. It only prohibits credits from continuing education provided by their employer. So I think that this leaves open that a licensee could potentially take a continuing education course that was offered by another drug manufacturer other than their employer, and that would not run afoul of the statutory language.
Just
Question.
so you're,
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I was just, go ahead.
Could you speak to where the 10 hours came from? I think if I'm remembering correctly, 5 hours CE for renewal is in statute, but the 10-hour pre-licensure is not in the statute. Can you speak to where that, why that was chosen?
So the statute does not specify any particular amount of time for pre-licensure education. 10 hours is something that I got from internal feedback that based on the content that we were originally looking at putting into the pre-licensure education, that we did not believe that 5 credit hours would be sufficient to put that together. Certainly in terms of kind of thinking about things that might be a good thing to have kind of in discussion for next meeting would be kind of like, what is the appropriate content for pre-licensure education? What is the appropriate number of credit hours for pre-licensure education? I think that there was
Nini, as a benchmark there, and I looked it up. I know for me in my state, it's 30 hours every 2 years for pharmacy license. Oregon's the same. So it just seems like 15 hours a year for a pharmacy compared to this, it seems this is kind of high.
So it wouldn't be 15 per year. Sorry, this is Haven. It would be 10 for your initial year before your license is approved, and then it would be 5 every year after that. So in the statute, it requires training in ethics, pharmacology, laws and rules applied to pharmaceutical marketing, and other subjects. So even if you took only, ethics classes are usually more than an hour, but all of those things plus what people should be doing to get started, it's just the initial education is higher than the continuing education, which is usually typical of licensing programs, is that your initial education is more detailed, and then your continuing education is just updating on that information, right, or the products. So that is where the 15 comes. It's not 15 a year, it's 10 for your initial. The only reason it comes out to 15 the first year is because we are not requiring the pre-licensing to be completed prior to licensing, because obviously we're up against a deadline here. So each license that is granted for the year 2022 is conditional on the condition that there will be 15 hours completed by the end of 2022 before the 2023 renewal. If we're going to have discussions about how much pre-licensing education is needed, that's fine. This is just the number based on what SBS 763 required and what we know from other programs. 10 seemed like an appropriate number, but that is, up for discussion.
Just for clarification, the 763 doesn't require those categories of training. They suggest them in terms of the content, the potential content, the permissive content of the pre-licensure training. They don't require hours in ethics, pharmacology, laws and rules required applying to pharmaceutical marketing. Those are permissive topics that may be included in pre-licensure training.
Yes. I apologize if I misspoke.
Well, no, it's pretty material because if it required all 4 or 5 of those, then certainly 10 or who knows, maybe 25 hours of pre-licensure education would be most appropriate. But it does not require all of those. Those are merely including included suggestions. And if you look at Chicago's, I think it's pretty it's more related to the process, what we're going to be taking a look at, what we're going to be tracking, what your the expectations are of you as a licensee, what you are subject to civil penalties or potential, punishment, if you will, for violating. They're not trying to make sure that sales representatives have a medical education background before going out and detailing prescribers.
Numi, just a clarifying question as I'm looking at this new language in section 2. With sub B and being registered, would those education providers that you're allowing in sub A, would they have to register too, or would you just automatically be allowing those Chicago courses? I'm just trying to make sure I'm reading all this correctly.
The intent is to require them to register. My understanding is that that's not a particularly onerous process, and that it's simply for our record tracking purposes. So it's our expectation would be, since we'll be having the sort of full CE rules in place for next year, that anybody who's going to be looking to be providing continuing education to support this program in the future is going to need to be registered with NIPR in the future. So that asking them to do that during the next year, since it's not necessarily requiring them to prove anything beyond just having set the information and being able to send certificates of completion through our system, I don't believe it'll be particularly onerous burden on CE providers for this purpose. Haven, do you have anything to add?
No, that is my understanding as well, is that they would just register within the system that we have to track it. And then that way the licensees actually don't have to provide the information because they're already communicating directly with us through the system.
Yes.
Tina had a comment in the chat. I can't find it now, but when you first went over this, she was talking about who they would actually register with, and she seemed to have a clarification as far as who the education providers would be actually registering with. But like I said, I can't see it in the chat any longer.
Tina, can you help with that?
So this is Haven. I'm not sure if she's available. It would be through state-based systems, and they have I think it's called business to business state-based system website that they would register with and then upload the information, and then it would talk to our system.
Okay. Okay, thanks. And have you guys done any kind of cross-reference with the programs that are listed on the Chicago website to see how many of them or if any of them are actually registered with the NIPR? I'm not familiar with it. That's why I'm curious.
I have not, but I would doubt very much that they would be, since Chicago does not use NIPR as their software system to track this information.
Thank you. I mean, certainly we can discuss this further, but ultimately this is going to be what we're using for the long term. And although the longer form rules for the continuing education provisions did allow for things like methods of providing proof for unregistered courses, the requirements for documentation are significantly more onerous for the licensee. And so like our thought would be, in terms of making things as smooth as possible for licensees, that having system tracking. My power is flickering. We have quite high winds, so if I disappear, that is why. So just giving you a heads up on that, but we'll go ahead and continue the discussion. I think that there was a couple other things that I didn't kind of get through, just to try and make sure we get to everything that I wanted to address on today's agenda. The way that we've proposed structuring this, considering a license for 2022 as provisional, renewal is conditioned on the completion of 15 hours of education, there's 10 hours of pre-licensure education, 5 hours of continuing education. And then what we have put down here is basically the same as what I had last month. I will be moving those terms just to kind of refer back to what we're allowing. And most of these categories are things that were pulled from the Chicago program. So hopefully there is already some good amount of stuff in place. There were a number of comments that asked us if we would be able to put together a directory of, or a listing at least of courses which are approved. That is definitely something that I can get back and see if that would be feasible for us to get together by January 1st. So that is another consideration. So that's kind of just the general structure that we are looking at right now. Are there any, I'd like to kind of move on to this issue of the suggested changes to the definition of pharmaceutical representative. Is there any other comments just kind of quickly on the CE stuff? One thought could be that, like, if we discuss, you know, the 10-hour figure for pre-licensure education next month and we land on a smaller number, whether that's 5 hours or 7 hours or whatever, like, we can adjust that throughout the temp rule to kind of reflect where we actually end up landing. But in the meantime, like, the 5 hours of CE is a statutory requirement, so I cannot adjust that. Any other thoughts on CE? Okay. So the
Excuse
other
me,
thing,
Nikki, not on CE, but before you leave this
yes,
renewal application, I'd still note that the temp rule still contains the 30 days renewal, which obviously would be important because these folks will be potentially looking to renew their license for 2023. But at the last meeting, we talked about the fact that that would be really difficult for the department to require, since the license in 2023 wouldn't actually be required until a sales representative was about to exceed 14 days of work in the state. So we kind of skipped over that when you were reviewing this temp rule application, license application provisions, but I'd appreciate some kind of we appreciate amended language that wouldn't conflict with the statute with regard to when the license is required.
right. I think to some extent, kind of what we were looking at and what this, we discussed this a bit last time, was simply like, again, this is related to limitations in terms of our software solution, and that the license has to exist in some sort of status, whether that is, you know, current or expired. And to some extent, like, that is kind of what we're looking at here, is simply that this 30 days after the deadline is what we are looking at for kind of swapping over to expired in our system. What I'll note is that the terms for initial licensure and renewal are almost identical in terms of process. The fee is the same. The information submitted is the same. The identifier in our system is going to be the same for the same person if they're applying later. So there isn't a huge difference ultimately for the applicant in terms of going through initial licensure or going through renewal. So that at least has been my understanding from talking with the staff who will be implementing this program, is that it shouldn't be. I mean, it's a semantic difference rather than a technical one. if you're applying for a new license 6 months into the year, as opposed to applying to renew your license at the beginning of the year. I do appreciate that there is that concern, and like I will take that back and see if there are other ways we could treat that in terms of the sort of grace period idea and what we can actually do with our technical system. But that may be something that is more an issue with our software solution rather than being kind of an actual implementation problem.
And I certainly can appreciate that. But again, the law doesn't require it. So you guys have been very careful to make sure that you didn't supersede any authority provided you under 763, and requiring a sales representative to get a license before they work 14 days in the state would do just that. And I think you saw in some comment letters, not mine, but folks who actually pointed out that territories change. Folks may not know whether or not they're actually going to need a license for, let's say, for example, 2023. And then some sales representatives may not work the 15 hours in a given state, depending on what the requirements of their particular position or drug or what happens to be. So if it's a glitch in the software, I can appreciate that, but I think we need to figure out a way to make sure that we're not requiring folks to get licensed if in fact they don't meet the licensure requirements under the law.
And exactly, and I think, and Numi, you said something that I wanted to clarify too, that your license doesn't expire until 30 days after it expires, like, so January 31st, January 30th is when your license would expire for the.
I think that was maybe me misspeaking.
Okay.
It would expire on the 31st. You have 30 days to renew, and that kind of goes to inactive in our system. But I mean, I could be wrong about that. I appreciate there's been some interest in kind of this grace period concept that we had in the draft rules, and I would like to, if there's other thoughts on it, that's like, please, I know that there was a lot of this in the comments, and I will go back and kind of look through that again as I'm working on the language that we're hoping to put forward for the permanent rule. But I really would like to address these suggested changes to the definition of pharmaceutical representative.
Are we going to have another opportunity to talk about the temporary rules then?
Yes, I will have an updated draft of the temp rules, and I will have an updated draft that is kind of the template for the permanent rules available for our next meeting next month. So like, as far as kind of whether it's dividing the discussion, I mean, ultimately, it's like, I want to get stuff squared away for January 1st by the end of the next meeting at the latest time. So that's kind of where things are at. But I would like to move on to comments that were related to one from Pacific Source. Let's see. This was.
And Numi, this is Chloe. I think I can speak to this. Rick and I submitted these comments jointly, but I'm happy to kind of kick things off.
Mm-hmm.
I think the thought on our end was just trying to provide further clarification. I think especially given right now when there are quite a few people who are promoting pharmaceutical products to healthcare providers, just generally, who are not doing this as their job or as a pharmaceutical sales representative. So that was just kind of the thought process on our end of adding that clarification to the end of that. So that was kind of just the gist of what we were thinking, of just trying to make it clear that you were doing this on behalf of the manufacturer as your job, adding that clarification.
Rick, do you have anything to add to Chloe's summary of that?
Nope, Chloe said it the exact same way I would have.
Okay. Could either of you provide me some examples of sort of people who you are thinking would be marketing or promoting pharmaceutical products to healthcare providers who is not doing so on behalf of the manufacturer?
I think, I think given the current COVID environment, there are a lot of people who are promoting different types of products to healthcare providers. And that was the example that folks on our end were thinking about. And so that was kind of the clarification we were trying to make. There might be a different way to say that in this or to clarify the definition from statute, but that was just kind of the thought process on our end of wanting to make it really clear what we were talking about and not adding in people unnecessarily to this. But that 15-day requirement too, I think might help prohibit some of that.
Plus, I mean, it does seem like the structure of the statute is really about focusing on the representatives for the manufacturers, for someone, for an entity that, and so just clarifying it in the definitions helps, I think. And
you also want to delineate RX drug versus OTC or not?
I think if I could check back one sec here. Pretty sure that the intent was to not extend to over the counter. Yeah, so like since our definitions are already referring back to prescription, maybe legally dispensed only with a valid prescription, like I don't think over the counter will be a concern.
Good.
There was another comment that was related to definitions.
Yeah, I can jump in, Numi, if you want.
Yeah.
Daria McGrew on behalf of Pharma. We're seeking some clarification, mostly for compliance, to make sure that all companies are on the same page, because I think that simply having marketing and promoting might be too broad, and would like to have that made very clear. Two different issues here. One is you might have a regional manager who's overseeing sales reps but is not interacting directly with any healthcare providers. So we would like to make clear that managers and supervisors are not don't need to be licensed. And the other thing is this, which they did clarify in Chicago, that there is a specific role called a medical science liaison that is a very technical scientific representative who is not on a sales or marketing team. They often interact as a very specific, say, disease-specific representative, training healthcare providers on specific disease states. They might liaise. They might be in the state, for example, as a liaison to a clinical trial. But they are not marketing or sales professionals, and we would appreciate a clarification that medical science liaisons are not, in fact, sales representatives.
Is that something for folks in this role where most often like a provider would be reaching out to them rather than them reaching out to a provider? Is that
yes, that's a peer-to-peer. If you go back to your definition that you just showed, I think it's already covered at the top, because you're talking about promoting. MSLs cannot promote, they do not promote. It's peer-to-peer scientific exchange, and it's reactive, not proactive. But if you go to your definition that you already had, Numi, I believe it would already exclude them, but we can check. Where you had it at the top?
Yeah, let me see. So like the definition that we have right now is pharmaceutical representative.
Promotes. Yeah.
A person who markets or promotes pharmaceutical products.
And MSLs do not do that.
Yeah, that was kind of my initial reaction to the comments from Pharma. I think that the conduct that we're looking at would already not apply to the people who were described in your comment. So. And based on your description, it would not be our intent to do so. So I don't think that there is a necessity to kind of go beyond. I do recognize that maybe kind of the direct peer-to-peer interaction, I do realize that was not actually addressed in the original language. And so that might be, or not peer-to-peer, but rather direct interactions. So the issues that are related to managers So I will look at adding to the next draft related to direct interaction. So like adding something related to that, I think should be sufficient to exclude managers, except to the extent that managers, as is the case in many professions, do also engage in the bread and butter work of their profession, as well as supervising a team. So to the extent that even if somebody is a sales team manager, if they are acting as a representative themselves in some terms, they would still be required to be a licensee if they are doing so for 15 or more days. Okay, that was helpful. I appreciate the feedback from Brian on that, and like, I do agree that I think that our existing definition would exclude medical science liaisons without additional clarifications. So I don't think that I'm going to make a change to that.
And Numi, just on that one, there was some discussion about that, obviously, in Chicago, because the rules reflect that very definition that Pharma requested, because there was some interest in when those rules were being written to make sure that that clarification was made. And because the Oregon bill, the 763, mirrors Chicago's ordinance almost right down to the last period, I think the interest was in making sure that if there's any kind of legislative history or reference back to whether or not MSLs were contemplated or included, that, you know, we could safely say that no, in fact, because they're not promotional, you know, they can't be at booths, they can't be at congresses, they're not contemplated by the bill, but that it would be specified in the rule like it was in Chicago. As much for the sales representative as for the provider who may reach out to contact them. So it wasn't just a reporting kind of requirement, but it was just to make perfectly clear that a provider was not going to be triggering this kind of reporting by reaching out to an MSL for some scientific, necessary, required information regarding the disease state in which they're actually treating patients.
Okay, I appreciate that. I will take a look at the language and see if maybe there's the possibility of a middle ground, and I'll discuss that with my team as well in terms of making sure that we are crafting this definition in a way that captures the people that the intent was to capture in this, and not going broader than that. So I think kind of like I will plan to add some language related to direct interactions. I thought that was already in there, but it is not, so I will add that in there, and I'll look at whether doing some additional clarification to make sure that, you know, MSLs, based on what has been described today, doesn't sound like it's covered for me under the existing language, but I'll look at whether some additional clarification.
Thank you.
Helpful. Karen, do we have anybody signed up for public comment?
No, we do not. I don't see anybody in the chat either.
Great, thank you. Well, we have 7 minutes left, so I'm just going to do a quick kind of rundown of next steps again, and kind of just and then we can use any final minutes that are left over. If there's any leftover thoughts people want to throw into the ring while we have everybody together. I'd like to have RAC comments back to me by close of business on November 9th. This is the same timeline as last time. 2 weeks from today, it's 1 week before the next meeting. I will be on vacation when these come in, so but I will be able to look at them at the end of that week. So that is kind of what we're looking at. Again, I'm giving you 2 weeks, and I'm giving myself basically 2 days to look at all of this. So please don't say that this is too short of a timeline for y'all. So if we can get those back by November 9th, close the business, that'll be amazing. RAC meeting number 3 scheduled currently for November 16th in the afternoon, 1:30 to 3 p.m. That is another typo, sorry about that. And looking to bring you hopefully a final draft for the temp rules that we'll be putting through the process to have an effect on January 1. And then I will be presenting a draft that is hopefully going to be the basis for the permanent rules. And based on how the discussion goes on the 16th, we'll make a decision as to whether it makes sense to schedule any additional RAC meetings, whether that's in December or January. So like we're not under a super time crunch for the permanent rules. So like having a couple additional meetings, if it's necessary to kind of filter out all of the additional issues, I think should be okay. But that's kind of where we're at. I'll look to bring back a draft of temp rules. That's more or less final. I'll look at bringing back a draft of permanent rules. So that's bringing back the reporting stuff, bringing back all the education stuff for sort of long-term implementation. Discuss that next time. I would appreciate feedback from the group in general on what should be included in pre-licensure education and how much pre-licensure education we should be requiring. So that is what I'd be particularly interested in hearing comments from the group on. And I think that gets us set up, tries to give you a roadmap of where we're going next. We have 5 minutes. Does anybody have any additional thoughts that they'd like to throw in that we weren't able to discuss, or any leftovers of stuff that we didn't discuss enough?
Numi, just a process question. So when we're done with the temp rule, that would be filed and effective 180 days, or it would run 180 days. So then the permanent rules would need to be done before that 180 day period is up. So do you have a sense from the rulemaking file when the temp rule might be implemented or filed with the Secretary of State?
Soon.
Okay.
Yeah, Karen, you know what's our deadline on the temp rule for getting it together?
Well, so Rick, are you asking when the temp rule would be effective?
Or when would it be filed?
Or
yeah.
Oh, yeah. No. I have to work with Numi on that. I don't know, Numi, what are we looking at filing the temp in December? I don't know. I mean, that's kind of what I'm thinking would happen, but
yeah, I mean, my intent would be to get things filed in mid-November or early December.
Oh, that'd be awesome. That'd be awesome.
So ideally, I would like to see everything hammered out on the temp rule basically at the end of our next meeting. So I'll reserve some time on that agenda for discussion of the next draft of the temp rule. I'm gonna take back the suggestions that we've had from today's discussion and from the comments. Look at if there's anything we want to change before we put this in place and go forward. That is because we do have some of those elements that are referring to back to amount of pre-licensure education. That's why I particularly like some comments back about how much of that we want in, because like if we're kind of combining pre-licensure and post-licensure education into one package for the first year, like whether that's 10 hours or 15 hours or I'd like to be able to have that defined. I think I have enough information to deal with the rest of the issues that have been raised, but so because we didn't spend a ton of time on the other stuff that was in the continuing education, certification, proof of submission, proof of completion, et cetera, like I don't necessarily expect a ton of comments back on that stuff at this point. It's just like know that the plan was, kind of on the reporting requirements that we're looking at changing it to annual. We're looking at starting collection basically in April or May of the year after the license. So that's kind of where the direction we're going on drafting for that. And I'll be able to present modified language reflecting those changes to next month. So like, I don't think that there will be a ton of discussion on the other stuff. So like, get a draft together as fast as I can and try and get that back to you sooner than the night before. But again, like I have some vacation time scheduled, and the comment due date is 1 week before the next meeting, so no promises. Questions, thoughts, concerns?
Just from my perspective, I know there was a question about getting the meeting documents posted for today's meeting. Just from a rulemaking standpoint, this is like the crunch time for me. So I won't promise they'll get posted until the end of this week. So I'll work with our web tech and see if we can get those up by the end of Friday. Hopefully sooner, but.
Thanks, Karen.
Yeah, and that goes for the recording as well.
Great. Well, we are at 11 o'clock. Thank you, everybody, for a lively discussion. Thanks, everybody, for all your thoughtful comments. We really appreciate this. This has been a complicated set of rules to RAC. So really appreciate the discussion and all your participation and feedback. So thanks, everybody. Karen, you can go ahead and stop the recording, and I will see you all